Exit Wounds. Peter Godwin will discuss his memoirs and the life of a perpetual emigre with Georgina Godwin. Peter Godwin was born and raised in Zimbabwe after working as a human rights lawyer and a foreign correspondent for the Sunday Times and the BBC. He has authored 6 non-fiction books and won the George Orwell Prize and the Esquire Apple Waterstones Award for his book, including Mukiva. His latest book is Exit Wounds, a story of love, loss, and occasional wars. In conversation with him is Georgina Godwin, who is an honorary fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. She's a broadcast journalist and presents the author interview program, Meet the Writers, and the current affairs show, The Globalist, on Monocol Radio. She was founder member of Zimbabwe's first independent radio station before being declared an enemy of the state and exiled to London. She's also on the board of the charity English Pen. May I request Peter Godwin and Georgina Godwin to take their places on stage. Thank you.
Hello, hello, and thank you. Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you to the Kolkata Literary Meet for having us here. We are absolutely thrilled to be here. We think we may be the first sibling duo to ever appear at this festival. Thank you. We also think we are probably the first Zimbabweans. I don't know, can anybody confirm that? No Zimbabweans here before, probably. So we're going to take that as 2 firsts. This is my big brother, and I am so proud of him for this incredible book, a book that has been sweated over not just at story level, at paragraph level, at sentence level, but at syllable level. This book has been part of his consciousness for years, indeed part of both of our lives for such a long time. And it's so wonderful to bring it to an audience here, half a world away, which might feel on the surface like it's very, very different from the world that we come from. But I think as we talk, we'll discover that's really not the case. Peter, I think we should really start with why we ended up where we ended up and how we got from there to here.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out to see us, listen to us. This rather embarrassing, I have to admit, is my 3rd memoir. And somebody once said to me, why do you keep writing memoirs? And I said, well, it's not, why do research when you can do me-search? But and it is, when I teach writing at Columbia in New York, and I'm always telling my students that there's a difference between autobiography on the one hand and memoir on the other. And I used to work as a correspondent for BBC television years ago, and I use a televisual metaphor to describe the difference between autobiography and memoir, which is that in an autobiography, the writer, the author, is like the news reporter standing in front of the camera, talking to the camera. And if for any reason the camera were to sort of nudge away, then the reporter would move to be back in front of the screen. And that autobiographies are usually about famous people, and we're interested in the every minor detail of someone who's won an Olympic gold medal, or is an axe murderer, or whatever, something that's made them famous. Whereas a memoir, I think, is you're the cameraman, and you've got the camera on your shoulder, and you're getting to point it wherever you want at what you think is interesting, and you're delivering the soundtrack, you're explaining, you're the sort of safari guide, as it were, to your readers, but you're not trying to be in front of the lens the whole time. And I feel that if you write in the first person, there's also a kind of honesty about it, in that sometimes if you write in the third person, it has an almost sort of, it's like you're handing down the tablets from the mount. You're saying, this is how it is. Whereas, in fact, your truth is only a truth, not the truth. So that is just by way of an excuse to say why this is actually, and I promise, the third and last of a, she's laughing at me, of a trilogy of memoirs.
I'm laughing because he always says this. And then what happens is we have an adventure like this. So we're on this wonderful tour. We're going around India. We're going on to Sri Lanka and Bali and Australia and Singapore. And I just know some of that is going to make it into a book at some point. So that's why I'm laughing. But Peter, let's talk about why we were in Zimbabwe. Because looking at us and listening to us, perhaps more me than him, because he does, let's face it, have a bit of an accent, you might think that we were British, but I mean, although we've assimilated, that's not who we are. And I think the story of how we got there, and then what brings us up to this is worth telling.
So we were both born and raised in Zimbabwe, which was then Rhodesia. And I'm sure most of you know, was colonized by the British, although in a rather strange way. And we had our equivalent of the East India Company. We had the British South Africa Company. So Rhodesia has a weird background in that it wasn't directly originally colonized by the British government. It was colonized by Cecil Rhodes's British South Africa Company, and it is, to my knowledge, and I'm sure there's somebody here who can tell me if I'm wrong, which is frequently the case, I think it's the only country that I know of where the person after whom it was named it themselves. So it was called Rhodesia after Cecil Rhodes. Our parents, though, they emigrated to Rhodesia after the Second World War, and they were both English, as far as we knew. And they went out there in the early 1950s, and they settled in a very remote part of Rhodesia, right on the Mozambique border. And our mother was a doctor, a rural doctor, and she was the only doctor for thousands of square miles. And in her area, she ran leper colony, she ran a TB sanitarium, she did everything. If anything went wrong with you from birth to death, she was the only person there. And she ran these amazing vaccination campaigns where to get herd immunity, she would quite illegally go across the border, because that border sliced straight down the middle of the tribe that lived there, and she would bring them all in from that side and vaccinate everybody. And it was an extraordinary upbringing. But of course, nobody knows their upbringing is extraordinary when they're in the middle of it as a child, because it's all you know and it's normal for you. Our father was an engineer, and to meet him, he was a quintessential Brit abroad, striding around the bush in a safari suit and desert boots and a walrus moustache and a kind of clipped British military accent and an emotional force field round him. You couldn't get anywhere near him. And that, as far as we were concerned, that's who he was. And many years later, when I was already in my early 40s and had children of my own, our father had a heart attack, which at the time we thought was terminal. And on what he thought was his deathbed, he told us that, in fact, he wasn't British at all, that he was a Polish Jew, and that all his family had been killed in the Holocaust, and that our surname is not really our name. And in effect, what he did was he reintroduced himself to us as a stranger and told us this whole other story that we had no idea of. And it's a very strange experience, finding out, as adults, that your parents are not who you thought they were, or a parent in this case. And I think you put it best, which is that it feels a little bit like we imagine it would feel like as an adult being told for the first time by your parents that you are in fact adopted. Nothing about your lived life changes, but everything about the perspective from which you view it is different.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing it did was made us very aware of the fact that we'd grown up in this atmosphere where we knew there was a secret, but we didn't know what it was. And you didn't ever want to push that. You knew there was something. And honestly, now as adults, as we re-examine our past, we see so many areas where that we were just shut off from knowledge. And I think it was really exacerbated by an incident that happened to us when I was a child and Peter had just left home for university. But I think before we get to that, you should perhaps say what you had to do before you went to university.
So we came from a strange family at the height of white settlement in Rhodesia / Zimbabwe. There were never any more than 300,000 white settlers out of a population then of probably 10 million. And it was different to other colonies in the sense there were certain colonies that were settler colonies. South Africa was obviously one. Namibia was another, but originally settled by Germans. Zimbabwe and Kenya to some extent. But other countries that were British colonies like Nigeria had almost no resident white population at all. They just had civil servants and a few military. And Zimbabwe by then had declared independence against Britain, because Britain was shedding all of their colonies, and it declared independence and became an illegal state that was unrecognized by the United Nations, and a civil war began. And our family were white liberals, of whom there were very few. They sent us to multiracial schools, and they opposed the regime. And what happened with the few white families there is that once the war began, in order for their sons not to be conscripted into the war, if you sent your sons away to university outside the country, you could get a deferment. In other words, you were allowed out to do your university, and then after university, you were supposed to come back and fight. But in fact, those sons never came back. And that's what we had organized, and I was about to go to university in England, and a week before I left, I was about to leave, they changed the law and said this exception would no longer apply. So at 17, I was conscripted and did 2 years in combat, 2 years in the Zimbabwean Civil War before I went to England, and then turned up at 19 at university in England, never having been out of Africa before. And it's a strange experience. We had culturally heard about Britain all our lives, read British authors, absorbed this kind of British culture, but somehow seen it, when you go there, we realized you've only really been seeing it through the wrong end of a telescope, and that when you actually arrive there, it's completely different to anything you expect. It seemed to me sort of smaller and wetter, and kind of the people seemed angry, and kind of they all seemed cross with each other all the time. And I felt, not at home at all. It felt really strange, but kind of just this sort of distorted image of what we'd thought. And it was really only, I think, when I arrived in England that I realized how un-English I was. And that's a very confusing thing. In a lot of these books, there are recurring themes about home and identity and belonging, and trying to find your way in the world. And I've now lived on 3 different continents. And it's a very strange experience. I mean, for example, now that I live in America, where I live in New York, where I've lived for almost 25 years, and I have to say a big part of this book is a love letter to New York, which, having lived in many, many places in my life, I was a foreign correspondent and moved around, is as close as I've found to a place that is this giant mosaic that has people from everywhere. And that I think, I can't remember the statistic, but far fewer than half of the people who live in New York are from New York. Most people are from somewhere else. And nevertheless, in New York, every time I open my mouth, people say to me, "Where are you from?" Because I don't have an American accent, and they don't say it in a kind of aggressive or a kind of mean way, but of course the unspoken part of that "Where are you from?" couplet is the bit that says "You're not from here." So if every time you get into a cab or you talk to a doorman, or you interact with someone who says, "Where are you from?" You're getting that drip kind of confirmation that you're not at home because you're from somewhere else. So it's a kind of interesting process. Luckily, in New York, often the person who's asking you that is also not from New York. So it's not done in a kind of course, I mean, we'll come to this later, but you know, I left an America under one regime, and it is now under a very different regime where who knows how much longer New York will be able to be what it is.
Absolutely, absolutely. You also left Zimbabwe at a very febrile time. There was, as you say, a war going on. I was left at home with my parents, and I was ill at the time, and one night my parents woke me up in the middle of the night with some terrible news, which they then also had to relay to you.
I was at Cambridge by then, and I mean, I'll never forget it. The porter came up in those days. It was before cell phones. I'm giving my enormous Methuselah age away, and called me down to the porter's lodge. And my father was on the phone, and he told me that our sister had been killed in the war. There'd been an ambush, and she'd been killed together with her fiancé and best man 10 days before their wedding. And I hope none of you, I'm sure some of you will have, but if you've ever been in a situation where you've lost a sibling or a child at a young age, it does something to a family. Many families never fully recover. In fact, many marriages, it's unusual for marriages to stay together after the loss of a child. It's too traumatic. And something happened to our parents after that. It was as though the lights went off behind their eyes, and they never really came back on again. And one of the reasons eventually that I wrote my first memoir, Mukiwa, is that I realized that through this artifact of this book, things that we were never able to talk about directly to each other, about loss and about all of these things that we're mentioning, I could somehow access it through the artifice of the book, because we weren't really having this discussion. We were talking about the book, what I was going to write in it. And it helped us to get back together as a family by discussing it, because I was then writing it for all of us. And so it was a kind of therapeutic thing in a way. But for us, you know, the loss in the war was personal, it was familial, and many people, you know, it's interesting, when the war was over in 1980, when Zimbabwe became independent, this strange thing happens where, I know it sounds absurd, but you sort of think, well, the war is over, and it's like a play is over, and you expect the cast, you know, to all appear on the stage, and they're back and they're alive. And I somehow expected Jane, our sister, to reappear, but of course she didn't.
For many people in a situation like that, they take solace in religion. And despite the fact that our mother was a vicar's daughter and that we went to church schools, that's not something that was really meaningful for us. However, religion did become meaningful after our father died, and his new official religion, which allowed him, in the end, to be laid to rest.
So his last wish to me, in fact his only wish to me really, is that he asked me to promise that I would have him cremated. And of course I agreed. And then when I looked around, by then, for those of you who aren't familiar with Zimbabwe, it has collapsed into a terrible, violent kleptocracy, and it's essentially a failed state. And the last working crematorium in Harare, where we lived, in fact, in the whole country, now no longer worked. And so there was no way that I could get him cremated. And I felt terrible because it was the only thing he'd asked me to promise. It was his dying wish, and I was unable to fulfill it. So in desperation, I went to the local Hindu pundit and said, would there be any way they might let me, use their cremation site there? And he said to me, well, the government has said we're not allowed to burn white people on there anymore. And he said, we can only burn Hindus. And I said, oh, well, that's terrible news and whatever. And then he thought for a minute and he said, well, he could be converted. And I said, well, there's one little problem. He's dead. He said, we believe in reincarnation. It's fine. We'll do a workaround. And so he did this it was in his shop. He did this conversion. And I said, great, where shall I deliver the body? And he said, no, the oldest son has to do it. You have to do it. So that's what I did. He gave me some helpers. And we built. I now know how you build. How you build a proper cremation with the different woods that burn at different speeds, and it's quite, as I'm sure many of you know, very complicated business. And then we waited for 24 hours while the body burnt, and you don't get the sort of powdered version of ashes that you get in a commercial crematorium. The femur and bones like that don't. It's a very humbling and strange experience, burning your parent. And I wrote a book called When a Crocodile Eats the Sun, the second in the trilogy, which begins and ends with that image and it's afterwards we were talking about it and saying that this is a man who was born a Jew, converted to Christianity, and then in death became a Hindu. So he had many of his religious bases covered.
And of course, after our father's death, our mother found it almost impossible to remain in Zimbabwe on her own. In her late 70s, she was frightened to drive. There were so many carjackings. It was very, very difficult for her there. And that's really where this book begins, Exit Wounds. And Peter, I think maybe the way to talk about this book is to start with a reading from the very beginning.
Yeah. Just to set the scene, the reason, by the time our father died and by the time our mother came to England and stayed with Georgina, Zimbabwe, as I said, had become a failed state. It had the highest hyperinflation in world economic history. I did once have a heated argument with an economic historian who claimed that for one day in interwar Hungary, it was higher, but I don't count that. So that meant that, the publicity that Zimbabwe got about what was going on, a lot of it was for the white farmers, but that wasn't the main deal. The main deal was that anybody who had a pension, anybody who had any savings, those were zeroed out. Hyperinflation in Zimbabwe was so bad that the Zimbabwe dollar halved in value every 24 hours. It meant that the minute you were paid your salary or whatever, you had to run and buy something, anything, because that money was sort of ceasing to exist in value. And it's very difficult when you're on a set income through pensions or something to survive in a situation like that, which is why she ended up coming and staying with Georgina. And I'll read to you, this is in fact from the beginning of Exit Wounds, and it's from the very beginning, and it's from a chapter called Happy Tensing. When she turned 90, my mother sprang a final surprise on us. She started speaking in the voice of a stranger. Her usual voice is what linguists call RP, received pronunciation, the standard accent of the British upper middle class, although it's spoken by only around 5% of the population, most of them privately educated. Now, abruptly, she begins to speak in a frightfully mannered, haut Edwardian fashion. Instead of home, she talks of heum. The house is the heis. Ears is yes. Sex are burlap bags, sacks. A crash is what happens when cars collide or the stock market dives. And rather than being happy, something she would never admit to anyway, she is now happy. To say happy, your mouth must tense into a horizontal rictus. So linguists describe this posh patois as happy tensing. It is a Memsai bark that sounds so pretentious that we, my younger sister and I, assume she must be affecting it as a joke. No one really talks like that anymore, I tell my mother. Even the Queen has brought it down a notch. We give it a few days, hoping that this antique aristocratic accent will vanish as abruptly as it arrived. but it sticks fast. So we give this new fancier model of our mother the nickname Empress Dowager, or Her Grace, which also happened to be her initials, Helen Godwin, for short. While we try to figure out where this alien voice has come from and why it has suddenly shown up. The most obvious trigger, a mini stroke, is ruled out by her doctor. Her Grace is not much help in our quest. She denies that her voice has changed at all. I've always spoken like this, she insists. Always emerges as always. The Empress Dowager makes two other changes around this time. The first change is that for no compelling medical reason, she takes to her bed, as if prematurely lying in state. And she acquires a new bed, one of those hydraulic ones you see in hospitals, adjustable both in angle and in height. Whenever we visit her now, she presses the control panel to elevate the bed so that she can peer down at us in Solomonic judgment. The second change is that despite having always been acutely conflict-averse, allergic to embarrassment, oblique in her diplomacy, she now sheds her social filters. Doctors call this disinhibition syndrome. Like a toddler, Her Grace now blurts out whatever happens to move through her mind, however peevish or splenetic this may be. Indeed, she seems almost to relish causing offense, especially to me, her geographically distant offspring, resident over the ocean in America. My sister, Georgina, is the proximate one. She does all the dowager heavy lifting. She has carved out a bedroom for our mother, who cannot manage stairs, by erecting an office partition across the sitting room of her Canfield Gardens duplex in North London, a partition that brutally bisects the beautiful bay windows, destroying the aesthetics of symmetry and reducing the remnant sitting room to little more than a corridor, the sole furnishing in which is a Zanzibari daybed, whose crimson cushions, Bella, her hyperactive English Springer Spaniel, has ripped to shreds in lieu of flushing and retrieving the pheasants she was bred to hunt. Georgina and her teenage daughter Xanthi congregate instead in the small, dark, subterranean kitchen like Victorian below-stairs domestics. To assuage my guilt at being the absent son, I frequently fly over from New York, and as I always do, I overcompensate, sitting beside my mother's bed for hours at a time, chatting brightly and reading aloud to her in the belief that this will help her stave off dementia. But mostly, I am trying to convince myself that I am a good son. There is a sad symmetry to our relationship. I spent the first decade of my life trying to summon my mother's attention, and she has spent the last decade of hers trying to summon mine.
Thank you. You know, this sounds like we're giving you a sad story and that this is a sad book. It's really not. It's actually really funny in parts. And it has so many interweaving themes and so many well, you should explain it. But first, before you do, I would just like you to tell us why Exit Wounds.
So when I worked for the BBC, they started, and I was working as a war correspondent, they started sending us on these courses called hostile environments courses. And we thought initially, well, that's nice of the BBC. They actually want us to survive in hostile environments. And then we discovered it was a way to bring down their insurance premiums. But nevertheless, we would be sent down to these sort of rural estates in the West Country where ex-British Special Forces soldiers and medics and things would train us to do various things that would help us survive in war zones. And there was a guy there called Colonel Jolly, who was a Marine, Royal Marine doctor. And he had this slide, this carousel of slides, and he would show us different ways of dying. It was his sort of, catalogue of goriness. And he would show us someone who'd been shot, and the wound you could see from the front, and it was just a small, looked survivable bullet wound. And then the next shot, he would press the carousel, the next one would come around, and it was the same man, the same body, and it showed the exit wound. And he said to us, it's not the entrance wound that kills you, it's the exit wound that gets you. And what this book is about, it's about many exits. It's about leaving, it's about departures. And for me, what the theme of it is, and it's compressed into this year, it's the year that, you know, as a relatively old man at 60, my life in New York sort of collapsed. Our mother died, my marriage came to an end, and my kids left home. And so all of the pillars, these pillars of your own life, all started wobbling at the same time. And that's why I ended up having to kind of reassess who I was and how I survived, and all of these themes I was talking about, home and belonging and whatever, come to the fore again and need re-examining.
But it's written, you have this beautiful structure. I wonder if you'd explain how the book is laid out, what the sort of tree of the book looks like, if you like.
I mean, it goes back and forth across the Atlantic from New York to London and back, and there's an awful lot of natural history in it, because in the end I realized, you know, we grew up in rural Africa, how important natural history was to me. And one of the things that I start realizing, I mean, and had always realized really, is looking at bird migration, and how where we lived in southern Africa, all of these birds would spend the European winter with us, and then come a certain time, they would all leave again. And that the particular birds that migrated in most numbers, the white stork was one of them. And I remember as a child asking our father, where do they go? And he said, you know, he would find out, he wasn't sure. But he knew very well, because white stork's main location, the main place they go to in Europe is Poland, which is where he came from. So he'd seen them for the other half of the year in Poland, and we were now seeing them for this half of the year in Africa. And there's an interesting story behind bird migration, which is that for the longest time, Europeans had no idea where migratory birds went. They would suddenly, as autumn days grew long, these birds would take to the air and leave, and they had no idea where they went, because at that point, Europeans hadn't discovered Africa, so they just didn't know. And they had all these incredible theories that went back, some of them hundreds of years. I mean, for example, they thought at one point that that birds migrated under the water, that they went under rivers and the sea and they would disappear, that they would, and the craziest one was that they thought that they finally realized that birds went to the moon. That's where they went. They must all go to the moon, which when I was explaining it to my sons, and it sounds absolutely crazy, but then when you think that the moon determines the tides, for example, it doesn't seem that crazy. The moon does have these effects. And then eventually, very late in the day, in sort of 1800s or something, a stork arrived over northern Germany with an arrow in it. It's called in German the arrow stork. And they shot it to have a look at it. And what they discovered, the arrow they discovered, was an African artifact. They could compare it to things they'd got. And that it was only then that they realized that that's where birds went, that's where birds went for the winter.
So much natural history, as you say, within the book, and just so many interesting asides, so many facts. People often say to me they had to stop and look at a dictionary 3 or 4 times because it's just so beautifully written. I don't want to sort of, fangirl this, because of course he is my brother, but I think just looking at the time, we should go to audience questions now. So if anybody has any questions, I think there is a microphone there. Do give us a wave, and if not, otherwise we'll carry on reading. Yes, there's a question just there. Would you, who's got the mic for you? There we go, it's just coming.
First of all, beautiful session. I was not expecting to have an existential crisis on a Friday afternoon, but thanks for that. But the question was, I read a bit of both Mukiva and When the Crocodile Eats the Sun, beautiful books, but one thing that stuck with me was how you explored the human history with, the history of the state, the nation, and how they collide with each other. Personal is practical, personal is political. But the world that is rapidly changing in ways that probably is not good for in the long run, how do you expect this kind of political storytelling in a very neutral way, or rather looking at your own country, your own history, in a very detached manner is possible. You know, Mukiwa has this very tongue-in-cheek subtitle, A White Boy in Africa. And we are living in a world where a very different kind of white boy from Africa feels confident to do a Nazi salute standing in a global stage, where we are right now. So how do you look at that?
Yes, Elon Musk, the gift that keeps on giving. Yeah, people keep looking at it from different angles. I mean, it does look like a Nazi salute. Somebody else said that he was sort of doing an aeroplane thing, or I'm not sure. It doesn't look good. I mean, I've always thought that I mean, I'm an enemy of detachment insofar as I think from a writer's point of view, we're all attached. We may detach to attach somewhere else, but I get your point of how to tell these stories in ways. I mean, my editor, there's a wonderful sort of kind of history now in this particular book, because my editor in New York is a white Zimbabwean woman, and my editor in London is a black Zimbabwean woman, and we're living in all these different places and whatever, and we managed to sort of work together on this book. So when I teach writing, and this, I'm sure a lot of you have come across this, if you're even for this point, trying to tell a story, if you're in England, say, or in America or whatever, and you're from Calcutta, and you're trying to tell a story about something here, if you have a mixed audience of people, some who are from here and some who are from there, how do you tell a story without boring one group or bewildering the other group? In other words, you know, how do you manage to do that? Because one group needs the detail because they don't know anything about Kolkata, they've never been here. The other group knows all about that. So on the page, how do you do that? And you would think that what you would do is you would pull the camera back, you would be generic. But actually, the opposite is true. So the universal, it turns out, is in the detail. So if you zoom right in, if you describe something well enough, the person who already knows about it gets the thrill of recognition, and they get the connection that you're able to describe. It really does smell like that. It looks like that. It sounds like that. They get that thrill, and of course, what that thrill is also about. It's about authenticity, but it's also about connection. That they too have looked at this thing and felt the same way, or been in this situation and felt the same way. And if it's well enough drawn, the person who doesn't know anything about Kolkata or whatever can then imagine it, because you've given them enough little hooks. You know, I think writing it reminds me of Velcro. You put out Velcro is hundreds of little loops and then hooks that go onto it. And you put so many little loops out there that enough hooks can go onto it that you've got a bond. And that's what you're trying to do.
I think we've probably got time for one more question before we go. And there's a lady just there. The mic's just coming to you.
Thank you. That was very interesting. It's not so much a question. Both Africa and India were colonized by the Brits. When the Brits left many of the African countries, there was a tremendous backlash in South Africa, and specifically in Rhodesia or Zimbabwe. But nothing like that happened in India. How do you explain that?
It's a very good question, and it's something that we are always aware of when we come to India. And I've been to India several times before, and other parts of India. And I wouldn't presume to tell an Indian audience how it is, but certainly as an African coming here, that is always my overall impression. I think the part of it is what I've already touched on, which is that there weren't hundreds of thousands of settlers coming here. It was an administrative state more than it was a settler state. I mean, I know there were Anglo-Indians, but not in enormous numbers. I think that it ended sooner. I mean, it lasted longer, but it ended sooner. And my impression in Africa is that wherever indigenous people were forced to fight for independence and there was big loss of life directly in wars. The legacy of those countries has tended to be one-party states, or authoritarian, autocratic states. So, for example, in southern Africa, in the states that had colonial wars of independence, so in this case, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Namibia, Angola, I think those are the main ones. The ruling party that had been the guerrilla party fighting for independence is still in power, and they refuse to let anybody else come to power. They have a messianic sense that they delivered independence, and therefore they have a kind of divine right to continue to rule. And in many cases, they do that by cheating in elections or by not having elections at all or whatever. In countries that didn't actually have direct war, and oddly, you can include South Africa in this. It came right to the brink of a war, and the apartheid there was far worse than anywhere else. But they stopped just before having a full military war. The ANC is getting very close to losing power, or at least to sharing power already. And I think that the legacy of war is a very toxic, corrosive one that really affects the institutions, the new institutions at independence. That's been my impression in Africa. The other thing, just to touch on in passing, is the very, very different way that different European nations colonized. So, I mean, if you look at it in Africa, if you look at Portuguese colonies, French colonies, and British colonies, what tended to happen is that on a scale, the Brits would come in. There wouldn't be very many of them, and I'm joking a little bit. And they would go to the local people and say, "Who's the second most powerful chief?" And the people would point to this person, and the Brits would go to him and say, "How would you like to be the most powerful chief?" And they played everybody off against each other. And Nigeria, at the height of British rule, there were probably only a few thousand British soldiers there, able to, to manipulate and co-opt people. The French had a different way of doing it. So, for example, there were never any black members. If you were an African, you would never sit in a British government in colonial times. Whereas in France, Houphouët-Boigny, who then became president of Côte d'Ivoire, was a French minister who went to Paris. And the French would say to the black population of their colonies, if you speak French and if you eat croissants and you do this and do that, you can be a French person. You can be French. But which, of course, wasn't entirely true. It was a kind of con, but that's what they held out. And then on the other end of the spectrum were the Portuguese, who'd been there the longest, but they tended to stay on the coastal littorals. And they had a thing called assimilados, where you could assimilate. Was that me? Was that you? You could assimilate, and you could sort of you were allowed to do that. So it is very interesting, but it's definitely. I mean, when we checked into our hotel, there was a party a few days ago, and there was a big poster in the garden which had a picture of the Queen, and it said the Queen at 50 years, and that's extraordinary. For us to see that, it's kind of extraordinary.
Unfortunately, I think we've got time just for perhaps one more question, and then we're going to have to wrap up. And just before we do, I wanted to say, firstly, how kind it is of all of you to come, but how much we appreciate your support, and we'd love your continuing support in terms of Instagram, Twitter, Blue Sky, whatever your forum is. We're really trying to get this book out there and to get people to see that. And unfortunately, there aren't that many copies here. In fact, they may already be gone, but Peter will be there. If you have a copy, he's happy to sign your book. And of course, you can always order them. We'll be around for a chat if anybody didn't get a chance to ask their question. And as I say, your support in this and in helping this wonderful book on its way is so appreciated. Thank you for having us in Calcutta.